Do you know what I mean by the question, waking up?
Yeah, me and various other campaigners have been trying to wake people up to this for a very long time now. And it's just very difficult because it means changing our whole worldview. It means changing a worldview which says that more and more and more is not a good thing. It can be a bad thing. And particularly if that leads to more and more global heating and more disasters of the kind that are so clearly linked to it, like what we've just seen here in the UK and what we've seen in Valencia.
And you say the weekend's events are clearly linked to climate change, do you?
We know that storms are intensifying as a result of global heating, partly because sea surface temperatures are rising. That leads to much more extreme storms than we had before. We're seeing higher winds, we're seeing bigger dumps of rain. And we have not done what needs to be done to reduce global heating, but B, neither have we prepared ourselves for the impacts of that heating. So we've really failed on both counts. And for people like me, it's intensely frustrating because I'm 39 years now into being an environmental journalist and campaigner, and I've basically been saying the same thing throughout. And it feels like bashing your head against a brick wall. What does it take? As you so rightly ask, what does it take for people to wake up?
And the answer to that will be different for everybody, won't it? Because not everybody, and I would include myself in this, not everybody reads your articles or other articles or sees document. And I've seen the documentaries. I've spoken to Jonathan
Words
Porritt.
will be had.
I've read.
Yes, I've got them on my list.
I've read his most recent book. His book Going Green all those years ago. You'll remember it. It was the first book about the environment I ever read when I just left university. And I still for a long time regarded it as an over there issue. And then clearly over the years, it's become clearer and clearer that there's no such thing as over there when you're talking about the safety of the planet. Over there is everywhere. But people will absorb this and metabolize that information at their own speed, at their own pace. What do you say government responsibility is here? Because Keir Starmer's response about meat eating and other elements of life was an interesting one, wasn't it? No, I'm not going to tell people how to live. No, not me, Gov. No nanny state here. What do you say to that?
So government has to lead on this. I mean, the effort to wake people up has effectively been privatized. It's left to people like me to do it. And I'd like to see my industry nationalized. I'd like to see government take control of environmental communication. And instead of leaving it to people like me, who are never going to be mainstream figures, mainstream voices, because our messages are frankly unwelcome, government has to be brave and say, okay, we are going to do the job of the Monbiots and others, and we're going to actually get out there and tell people what needs to be done. And not all those messages are going to be things that people want to hear, as I know to my cost over so many years of being told, you hair shirt, self-flagellating so and so, trying to get us to stop eating meat and to stop
You
using
do get
so
a lot
much
of that, don't you? You do get a
I
lot of
get a
that.
huge amount of it all the time. All of us do. It comes with the job. You just have to accept it as part of the job description. But we shouldn't be left alone to try to reach people. The only agency which has got the scope and the power to reach everyone in the country is the government. And when you compare it to other great crises that we've faced, like war, for instance, you look at the Second World War, the government was absolutely front and center of communication. Right, this is what is expected of you as a citizen of this country. Here are the changes you're going to have to make. Here are the things we're going to ask you to do. You have to be part of this. Instead, it is left to people on the margins like me trying to make a case which most people don't want to hear.
Do you see any evidence that that might change, given pressure from, the top, people like Ed Miliband?
He's quite marginalized within government from what I can see. I mean, he must shake his head and groan at some of the positions that the government has taken. It massively cut its Green Deal spending. Its Green Prosperity Fund was almost halved, and instead it's pouring money into new fossil fuel projects, particularly this farcical carbon capture and storage program, which actually means using more fossil fuel than before, raising emissions even more than before, and it's spending 22 billion pounds on setting that up. That money would be so much better spent on things like helping us insulate our homes, changing our transport systems, changing our food system.
You mentioned earlier on that not only is the job of, I guess, to use maybe a heavy-handed word about it, but education about this, bringing people with you on this, governments bringing people with you, that's one thing. But there is also the whole, the environmental protection, the physical infrastructure of our communities, particularly those communities at risk of flooding. And we've seen some dreadful examples. If you think back to what happened in Cumbria about a decade or more ago, probably 12, 13 years ago that was now. I mean, I remember being live on air there talking to two men, one on the roof of his house, another on the other roof of his house, and they were speaking to each other and me at the same time on live radio. And I had to try and persuade one of them not to try and climb over to the other guy's roof. But the water was that high up their houses that they were only safe on their roof. And that was Cumbria all those years ago.
We're seeing repeated failure of flood defences, and that's because of a lack of investment. So there's two issues here, really. There's at the bottom of the catchment, where people live, in the towns, in the villages, we see flood defences crumbling because they haven't been maintained. They also haven't been improved to meet the growing challenge of climate disasters. But also further up the catchment, we see almost a disaster waiting to happen. The hills are bare, and rain flashes off bare hills much faster than it flashes off hills which have got, excuse me, woodland, functioning peat bogs and the rest. The rivers have been straightened and canalized, and that rushes water down the catchment. You need to re-wiggle the rivers. You need to have leaky dams in the rivers. Beavers do a great job, incidentally. They're a very
great builders,
cost-effective form of flood defense, letting the beavers go.
And you mentioned peatland and moorland and heather and stuff like that, and mossland. We've seen the fires on the hills in Lancashire, Yorkshire. Case in point, I
mean, grouse moors are still burning the peatlands. It's just outrageous. The owners of these grouse estates are still setting light to these peatlands, and that reduces their water holding capacity. So the whole thing, we know we're getting massive rainfall, and to an extent, there's a limited extent to which you can deal with that, but to the extent you can, you've got to try and hold it back. You've got to what's called attenuate the flood peak. That means you keep the water back up in the catchment for as long as possible and then release it gradually. And that means having a sort of gnarly, rough ecosystem which impedes the water,
not an overly manicured or abused ecosystem.
Exactly. And so having meanders, having gravel banks and islands in the rivers, having leaky dams, trees falling into all these are good things which hold the water back, but also having a much rougher land surface in the hills, which means more trees, which means blocking up the drainage ditches, holding it back in bogs, in wetlands. All that is a far more effective way of holding that water back. So if you do those two things, improve the flood defences at the bottom of the catchment, slow the flow from upstream in the catchment, then we'd have a much better chance of not being hit so hard by these devastating weather events.